Parker Panthers. So this is Mrs. Warren, of course, again. It's been a couple of days. Sorry I didn't get a video done on Friday. I was having some issues with a few things, the internet, the phone, but I think I've got it all working pretty well. As you can see, I've kind of changed setting. I'm sitting outside. It's kind of loud in my house with everybody watching TV and doing different things. But since I'm outside, there's some other things you might hear, some things you might see. There's a pond behind me in the next yard, and so you might hear the frogs singing to each other. We have a lot of green lizards that like to come around, so you might see them in the background. My dog is running around back here, crying because I won't put her in my lap, so you might hear her as well. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to read chapter 4, and then I'm going to give you some more information about where some of your work is being posted, and I'm going to give you a writing assignment for today, as I'm going to give you one for each day that we have. All right? So I'm going to go straight into chapter 4 from Guest. Chapter 4. The next morning, Ma'am carried Guest outside and laid him on Thomas's quilt. For once he lay still and watched the clouds float by in the shape of endless flocks of fluffy sheep. Crouching behind a bush, I spied on Guest while I weeded the garden. I was sure he didn't know I was nearby. Perhaps if I waited long enough, Guest might, just might, reveal something. Surely he had secrets. Maybe he knew where the kind folk were. Maybe they talked to him and he to them. A fly landed on my nose and I brushed it away before it made me sneeze. Ants paraded across my foot, tickling my toes. Beads of sweat trickled down my back. The sun was hot and the air heavy with summer. Bees buzzed in the foxgloves as if they were trying to lull me to sleep. Guest began wailing softly. Not a cry, not a shriek, but a sad sound that rose and fell. Not quite sobs, not quite a tune. Oh, look, I can even hear the ice cream man in the background. The song drifted across the garden and over the wall. It mingled with the breeze and the rustle of leaves. It ran with the stream of rocks, with the stream over rocks. It mingled with the singing of birds and the humming of bees. Sorrowful it was and beautiful. I'd never heard anything quite like it, certainly not from Guest. The song ended as suddenly as it began. Guest turned his head toward my hiding place. His yellow eyes found me and held me fast. Silent now and sly, he looked at me as if daring me to come closer. I got to my feet and stared down at him. Where did you learn that song? He kept his gaze on me. His expression didn't change, nor did he answer. Not that I expected him to. I might as well ask the cat. I leaned over him, my face mere inches from his. I don't know what you see when you look at me like that. Do you know what I see when I look at you? His face became secretive. I see an ugly, ill-natured creature. I spat out the words as if they were poison. An imp from the devil, as ugly as Thomas was beautiful, as nasty as Thomas was sweet. A magpie in the hedgerow cocked its head at me. Its wings stirred as if the bird was ready to fly away to the kind folk. No, I must not speak harshly to Guest or harm him in any way, not while Thomas was a prisoner of the kind folk. Ma'am came to the door and looked out. Is everything all right? She asked, meaning was Guest safe? Everything is fine, I lied. At the sound of Ma'am's voice, Guest began to shriek. He kicked and waved his fist. Bending over him, Ma'am picked him up with difficulty, as if he'd grown too heavy for her. Surely you're not hungry again. His answer was to strike her with his flailing fists and tear open her dress. By that evening, Ma'am scarcely had the energy to eat her supper. Her eyes were nearly as sunken as Granny Hedgepath's, and blue shadows discolored the skin under them. Her hair, once thick and shiny, hung limp in uncombed strings around her pale face. Her dress hung on her thin body. Late that night, I wrote Ma'am a letter. I have taken guest and gone to find Thomas. Do not worry. I will be safe, and I will bring Thomas home and leave guests with them that he belongs to. Please eat and rest whilst I am gone, and get strong. Love from your daughter, Molly. Quietly, I filled a canvas bag with a loaf of bread, a jug of milk, and one of water, a hunk of yellow cheese, and 6 apples. I didn't dare take more, for we didn't have much. I touched the locket hidden under my dress. Perhaps I could use it to barter with the kind folk. Like magpies and crows, they probably like shiny things. I tiptoed to the cradle. Guest lay still, but his eyes were open, shining like a cat in the dark. Expecting a struggle that would wake Ma'am, I wrapped him tight in a blanket that I slung onto my back. Without so much as a whimper, he let me carry him from the cottage. The dirt road was white in the moonlight, and the foxgloves that bordered it were black. Everything else dissolved in shades of gray. The fields quilting the hillsides, the stone walls, the grass. The only sound was the cry of an owl somewhere up ahead. At the top of Cattail Hill, I turned and looked back at our cottage, so small at the foot of the hill. I never spent a night away from Ma'am. Now here I was about to set out on a journey with no clear idea of where I was going, or when I'd be back, or even if I'd be back. But I trudged on, downhill and into the village. The moon silvered its thatched roofs. Windows were dark. Not a single candle shone. And there went the poster. I felt like a burglar creeping from the cottage to cottage, choosing which one to enter and rob. A dog barked on a narrow side street. A cat peered down at me from a high stone wall, eyes agleam. In one house, someone snored loudly enough for me to hear. That's about as loud as my husband snores. I paused to shift Guest to a better position. He'd still not made a sound, but he tightened his grip and dug his fingernails into my shoulders. This close, I smelled his wildness and quickened my steps. The sooner I found the kind folk, the sooner I'd be rid of the creature on my back. As we neared the old stone bridge that spanned the river, I saw a horse and cart stopped in the middle. The peddler leaned against the wall and played a penny whistle. On my back, Guest shifted his position to look over my shoulder. When the peddler saw me, he smiled, but instead of greeting me, he continued to play a melancholy tune. The music seemed familiar, but I didn't know where I'd heard it, only that I had. Guest dug his feet into my back and reared up to get a better look at the peddler. Lowering the whistle, the peddler said, "Well, well, if it's not little Molly Cloverall with the traveler's baby on her back, what brings you out so late at night? Not to buy ribbons and beads and flowers, I wager. The creature won't sleep unless I walk him about in the moonlight." I was surprised at how quickly the lie fell from my mouth. It soothes him. Ah, I've known a few babies like that. He reached over my shoulder to pat Guest's head. Careful, I warned. Sometimes he bites. The old man laughed. No fear. The meanest dog in the world knows better than to bite me. I took a step to pass the peddler, but he stopped me. If I were you, I wouldn't go any farther. The crossroads lie just ahead, and beyond them is Mirkwood. Both dangerous places for a lass and a baby on a dark night like this. Oh, I won't go farther than the bend in the road. I pointed ahead to a place where the road curved. You wouldn't be fibbing to me, would you? I crossed my fingers behind my back and shook my head. No, sir, I would not. Take care as you go, then. He stepped out of my way and doffed his yellow hat. Its black feather bobbed. May no harm come to either of you. With relief, I crossed the bridge and glanced back to see if the peddler watched me, but he'd already turned toward the village. His horse's hooves rang on the stone, and its harness bells jingled. All too soon, the road curved, and the village was behind me, no more than a huddle of cottages by the side of the road, now as small as heaps of stones left by children. Ahead, just over the hill, was Mirkwood. Hitching Guest higher on my back, I climbed the road to the top. From there, I looked down on the dark forest. It stretched as far as I could see, bordered by the sea on the far side and the dark lands on the other. Again, Guest hoisted himself high enough to see over my head. He yelped like a fox or a wolf, a strange, incomprehensible sound. From the forest, an owl hooted as if in answer. Going downhill, I picked up speed until stumbling on loose stones. I forced myself to go slower. It wouldn't do to fall. At the bottom of the hill were the crossroads, dark with sorrow and foreboding. Those who killed themselves were buried in this place. Murderers, too, and thieves. All those who weren't allowed to lie in churchyards, which is another word for cemeteries. Changelings and unwanted babies both have been left here to die. If any place was haunted, the crossroads was. Moaning softly, Guest clung to me and rocked back and forth as if he feared I meant to leave him here. I wished I could do exactly that, but I was almost certain the kind folk would take him and give me Thomas. As soon as we left the crossroads behind, Guest loosened his grip and stopped moaning and rocking. Very still now, he crouched behind me, as frightened as a frightened animal might. For the first time, I felt a twinge of pity, a very small one, for certainly Guest had caused a great deal of hardship in our family, and did not deserve my sympathy. You bringing the cat out? Or you're taking the cat in? Okay. Yeah, we've got a bunch of animals out here, so they go out, they come in. I'll see if my son might bring one over to me. Which one are you picking up?
Chloe.
Okay. Come back over this way and I'll be able to show my students Chloe. Well, if she wants to come out and see my son. She coming?
She's been out here for a while and she kind of needs to come in so she can eat.
Okay. Well, does she want to come in?
Here, Chloe. She's getting up.
Okay.
Never mind. She was getting up.
She might want to stay out a little bit longer. It's so nice.
She's been out here since like, the early afternoon.
Well, if she's not hungry yet, leave her out, and then as long as you get her back in at some point to eat. Anyways, I have to get back to my story. Well, we don't know if the cat's going to come out of the little place that it stays in or not. So if it doesn't, I'll show you her later. Anyway, back to the story. So again, Guest hoisted himself high enough to see over my head. He yelped like a fox or a wolf, a strange, incomprehensible sound. From the forest, and I'm sorry, I already read this part. Let me go to the next page. Catching light from the moon, white stones lined the path into the forest. After a few steps, darkness closed around me. I kept my eyes on the stones, afraid of what I might see, or if I looked between the trees on either side of me. Guest resumed moaning. He seemed to be as frightened as I was. Things moved in the shadows, too far from the path for me to see what they were. I hoped they stayed where they were. On my back, Guest moved restlessly and muttered to himself. His warm breath tickled my neck. With every step I took, he seemed heavier and my legs felt weaker. I longed to be rid of him. Too weary to go on, I eased Guest from my back and sank down to rest against the smooth side of a mossy rock. Guest huddled beside me, clicking and clacking to himself. Remember, that was kind of the noises that he made instead of making regular baby noises. Sometimes he glanced at me as if he expected me to understand him, but the noises didn't sound like words to me. If only you could tell me where to find the kind folk, I said. But you can't talk, and you can't walk. What use are you to me anyway, or to anyone? Guest hung his head and stared silently at the ground. For a moment, he reminded me of a lamb I once raised because its mother refused to nurse it. A useless runt, Dado called it. He told me to let it die, but I nursed it with a rag soaked in milk. When it was too big for me to carry, I let it go back to the flock. But Guest was not a lamb. He was a wicked creature. Unwanted by his mother or anyone else. He didn't deserve my pity. I squatted beside him and looked into his eyes. Do you know where we're going? Guest peered at me, wild and strange. Aw, Chloe. So this is Chloe, and she's one of the 4 inside cats. And she was hanging outside, and she's got bad sinuses, so she's going to go back in. You need to help her out with a wet rag.
I will.
Okay. Bye, Bob.
I'll leave you alone.
You're fine. Are there any other cats out here?
No.
Okay. So that was the last cat. Unless one wants to come back inside or back outside. Okay, so let's see. She was talking about him reminding her of a lamb. Oh my goodness. Okay. But Guest was not a lamb. He was a wicked creature, unwanted by his mother or anyone else. He didn't deserve my pity. I squatted beside him and looked into his eyes. Do you know where we're going? Guest peered at me, wild and strange. I'm taking you back to your own people, the ones who didn't want you, the ones who took my brother and left you in his place. The kind folk they're called, though they are not kind at all. I'll trade you for my brother and be rid of you forever. Guest made a mournful sound and curled into a small ball. Had he understood what I said? No, I told myself. He had no more intelligence than a dumb animal. Some animals are pretty smart, so you never know. I poked him as if he were a sleeping dog. Can I trust you to stay with me while I sleep? Guest curled up even smaller and covered his big ears with his hands. I poked him again, harder this time. You had better be here when I wake up. No answer, not even a look. If I had a rope, I'd have tied him to the tree. I covered him with the blanket I used for a sling and pulled another for myself from my canvas bag. I'd sleep for a while, then go on. Soon we'd find the kind folk. I was sure of it. Well, almost sure. When I opened my eyes, morning had come and Guest was gone. I leapt to my feet and gazed into the misty forest. The trees had kept their vigil. They still stood straight. They still stood tall and straight. But where was the changeling? Guest, I called. Guest? Guest, where are you? My voice bounced from one tree trunk to the next, but I heard no answer. I called again and again, peering into the mist, but I was afraid to leave the path. A few days ago, I'd have been happy that Guest was gone, but without him, I had nothing to trade for Thomas. I might as well go home. I opened my bag and pulled out the water jug. Before I'd taken my first sip, I saw Guest. He burrowed into the ferns like a fawn and almost buried himself into a hollow under a boulder. His back was to me, and he seemed sound asleep. Angry at the trick he played, I shouted, "Wake up!" He turned and looked at me, blank-faced as usual, and crawled slowly from his hiding place. The first thing he did was grab the milk jug from the bag. I yanked the jug away from him, removed the top, and held him while he drank. Such a greedy creature he was. Guzzle, guzzle, guzzle. You can't drink it all, I told him. I'll doubt if we find a cow in Mirkwood. He shrieked and screamed and flailed about just as he did at home, biting and pinching and kicking. It took all of my strength to swaddle him in the blanket and hoist him back on my back. As I walked, I ate a small piece of cheese while Guest screamed. Ahead of us, the ground rose steeply. Warm, damp air clung to me, and midges too tiny to see bit my face and my ears and my neck. Guest continued to wail and snort and snuffle. He squirmed and twisted, throwing his weight from one side to the other. I didn't dare turn and look at him for fear I'd throw him into the ravine that bordered the path. On we went, mile after weary mile. The farther I walked, the more the trees closed in around us. Very little daylight found its way through their leafy tops. Guest and I seemed to move through endless twilight, with no idea of the time. Morning, noon, evening, but not night yet, not yet. Sometimes I walked between the boulders that towered over us, their surfaces softened by thick coats of moss. Trees grew from the tops of some. Their roots twisted down the sides, digging into crevices. Water dripped from the rocks and pooled onto the path. I wished I thought to bring a walking stick to help me keep my balance. At the top of yet another hill, I felt Guest's body tense. His grip on my shoulders tightened. Very softly, he began to make a series of clacking sounds. At the bottom of the hill, a man leaned against a boulder, watching us make our way toward him. While he waited, he played a mournful tune on his tin whistle. The music put me in the mind of the song Guest had sung in the garden. From what I could see of the man, half hidden as he was in the tall ferns, he seemed a harmless sort. A wandering musician, perhaps. I'd seen his like playing tunes on market day, a cap beside him to catch coins tossed by generous folks. Keeping my eyes on my feet, I made my way slowly and carefully down the treacherous path. It was my hope that the man might know the whereabouts of the kind folk. Perhaps he would lead me to them. A bit of company would be a pleasure, especially if he was willing to carry Guest for at least part of the way. Okay, and that ends chapter 4, but I've got a couple of other things I want to talk to you about. I want to show you. So one of the things I've done is I've gone into Clever, I went into Flocabulary, and I posted 2 Flipgrid activities. One of them is a writing prompt that's going to ask you to write about a change that you've had to make because of the COVID-19 virus. And so that is one. The other Flipgrid activity that I'm going to put in for tomorrow is going to be a response to reading. So it's going to be a reading response that you're going to have to write and then, of course, record in Flipgrid. I'm also going to put both of those in Class Dojo. So if you can't yet get into Clever, you can see them in Class Dojo. So I also want to show you the writing prompt that I'm talking about. So let me pick it up. It fell on the ground. Okay, so I'm hoping you can see it. It says writing prompt for Monday, March 30th, 2020. Write about one of the changes you had to make since the COVID lockdown. And my expectation is going to be that you're going to write, I would like you to try to get a whole page, because as you know, when you record, when you have to do your Telepass recording, it needs to be for at least a minute. So I know that some students were thinking that our testing has been totally taken away. I know that the STAR test is not going to happen this year, but so far Telepass testing has not been canceled yet. They have said that the window is going to be open all the way up until the end of May. So there might be a chance that if we do go back to school this year, that you still might have to take that Telepass test. So for that reason, I'm going to make sure that I give you guys writing responses that you can write and then can record yourself in Flipgrid. If you can't get into Clever, then you can just respond with your writing into Class Dojo if that works, at least for now. Okay? And if you have any questions for me, you can post them in Class Dojo as well. So I'm thinking I'm going to go ahead and sign out now. Oh, one other thing. If you've been ever able to go into Clever, I also assign some work into social studies. I'm also going to put this work into Schoology. I know today Schoology kind of went down, I think, because everybody, not only in Aldine ISD, but in other districts in Texas, is using Schoology. So I'm going to make sure that I put that work in there for tomorrow. There's a couple of social studies assignments in BrainPop, and then I've got, like I said before, some assignments in Flipgrid. Okay. And I'm going to look about adding some more assignments as well. So places that you can look for that, if you go into the district's website, again, it will tell you how to get into Clever. It will tell you what your ID and your password is. And then once you go into Clever, you can access Flipgrid, and you can also access BrainPop, which is where I put our social studies activities. And I'll continue to put social studies, and there went the poster. I'll continue to put social studies activities in there as well. So it was really great talking to you guys, and I will talk to you again tomorrow. Take care. Miss you guys. Bye-bye.